into our special broadcast dedicated to journalists in Gaza. The war in Gaza has been one of the deadliest conflicts for journalists in modern history. Since October the 7th, more than 200 reporters and media workers have been killed, most of them Palestinians in Gaza. These journalists risked everything to document the war, often paying the ultimate price. The targeting of media workers has raised serious concerns about press freedom, accountability, and just the broader cost of this war on truth itself. And joining me right now is Zanele Mji. She's a South African investigative journalist, and I think I can also call her an activist because I think journalism is an act of activist. Zanele, thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate you giving us your time, and hope to have an insightful conversation with you about, I think, a very atrocious moment in human history.
Hi, Salero. Thank you so much for having me.
I think first and foremost, we can kickstart the conversation with, just your reaction as a journalist, as someone who's in this field, looking at what's happening in Gaza and this targeting with impunity on, colleagues, essentially. What do you make of it? How do you analyze, where we currently find ourselves?
Yes, I mean, I feel like what we're seeing happening to our colleagues in Gaza is not only a horrifying indictment on the lack of respect for the work that journalists do, not only in Gaza but globally. And for me in particular, it's very horrifying because I don't see this as something that we are all looking on from the outside of, but I interpret it as somewhat of a warning to journalists globally that uh, if we can sit by and witness these atrocities and horrors unfolding every day, not only to civilians, but to journalists who are very clearly, purposefully being targeted. It's like, as the saying goes, I watched as they came for those people over there and those people over there. And then when they came for me, there was no one left to defend me. And so I think this is a testing of press freedom. It's a testing of the sanctity of the press and the work that they do. And I think that what happens in Gaza to journalists and to the work of journalism is going to be something that reverberates across the planet and across time. If journalists in Gaza and in Palestine are not safe, none of us are safe.
I would like to, bring it a bit home. Just looking at how our own media space has covered this genocide, and also to kind of understand from your perspective if there's an understanding from our journalists here in South Africa on what's happening in Gaza, not just to the general population, but specifically to journalists. I mean, you have an institution like SANEF that has not even released a statement. I'm not sure if I've missed it or I haven't seen it, but they've literally not said anything about this continued killing of journalists and the targeting of the truth, essentially, in Gaza.
It's true. The way things have unfolded have really shown how have really called into question this idea that the press is an independent fourth estate that's there as a watchdog and that is there to tell the truth. I mean, we're really seeing the fault lines in media globally, where it seems that a lot of titles and a lot of journalists and a lot of organizations that you would expect to be using their platforms to draw attention to what is happening to our colleagues seem to be very hesitant and seem to be not able to kind of come down on what is right and what is wrong. And that's what I mean by we're honestly seeing the weakening of the integrity of the press globally. It's not just the destruction of the free press in Gaza only. It's the destruction of the free press globally.
And the response would be, it almost feels like we are in a new chapter of this genocide. It feels like there's a new wave. You have the re-emergence of Donald Trump, and he seems to have invigorated this regime before the end of last year, I think there was some hope that, there are ceasefire talking, there was, those cessations of attacks, even though we know to some level it wasn't real, it wasn't true, because Israel continued with the impunity and the attack on the people of Gaza. My question is, how do we, as journalists from across the world, how do we, as people that are in solidarity with the people of Palestine and their cause, respond, to this new wave, to this new phase of this genocide?
It's one thing for the news not to be getting out of Gaza, right? It's one thing for the Palestinians, the journalists who are on the ground, whether they're Palestinian or from the global press community, to be struggling to get news from Gaza outwards. But I think there's a huge role for the rest of us who are around the globe to play with our reporting, where, yes, we are drawing attention to Rafah and Gaza and to Palestine and what's happening there, but we also need to, within our own countries and communities, need to be reporting on all of the other connections to this war, right? We saw that here in Johannesburg within the last month or so, there were protests outside of African Rainbow Minerals against Glencore for those calling out those companies for supplying coal to Israel. There's so much more. There's a deepening and a growing of Israel's connections in Southern Africa and Zimbabwe and in other countries around South Africa. And so as journalists, we need to be drawing as much attention as possible to the situation on the ground in Gaza, but there's so much other work to be done to be promoting accountability against private companies, against governments who in other ways are supporting and enabling this war on Gaza to continue.
I think
We have work to do in our own spaces. There's so much to report on.
No, definitely. I wanna touch on the point that you're making. That we saw those protests at Africa Rainbow Minerals, where the connections were made on how still have South African businesses doing direct business with Israel, despite them literally genocide, one that's being live streamed. Why are we not seeing more of that? Why are we not seeing in South Africa that active kind of journalistic investigative journalistic work that connects the dots, that exposes companies and organizations that are still directly working with Israel, that are still getting and sending money to Israel and essentially funding this genocide? Is there a lack of resources, as I've heard many claim, or the will is just not there?
I'll keep coming back to it and saying we have never been more insecure as the global press. We're more insecure than ever, right? Our newsrooms are functioning with limited capacity, limited staff, limited funding. And so we've had the loss of, beat journalism, which is like where you dedicate one journalist or to really just digging into the same issue. We should have journalists in our newsrooms who are specializing on focusing on this one issue, because there is just so much that is happening with this war, right? But like we hear all the time, there's no resources, there's no journalists, there's no adequately trained journalists to be doing these kinds of investigations. And then there's this complexity of newsrooms need finances to survive. They're businesses like any other business, and so there seems to be this kind of insecurity around which toes they can step on as far as advertisers and funders, and which there seems to be this fear to report on certain players, to report on certain issues with this insecurity of, will this mean that we lose advertisers? Will this mean that we already in such a compromised position, the news media is already in such a compromised position here in South Africa already, with closures and lack of funding and lack of staff. And so there just seems to be this fear of this independence has been lost. Because people are trying to balance bottom lines with reporting.
Can we say the South African media space has failed the people of Palestine?
I would say yes. Of course, I don't want to generalize. There has been consistent reporting and on Gaza, on Palestine. There's been consistent reporting on, South Africa's ICJ case. But I do believe that in terms of, like you mentioned, that journalism is activism.
Mm,
The saying goes, if person A says it's raining and person B says it's not raining, you look outside and you decide, who's right. But there seems to be within the South African media this hiding behind this sort of very neutral, just reporting of events. I think we could strengthen our analysis a lot more. I think we could strengthen and express our political convictions a lot more, because South Africa's history with Palestine and that sort of solidarity goes back decades and decades and
mm,
decades. Um, we know which side of this issue we are on as South Africans, but there's this sort of, yeah, there hasn't been as much of and there are many journalists who are trying. I'm part of groups of journalists who are taking on the activism aspect of our work and, keeping an eye on the situation and speaking out for our colleagues. But as a whole, and if I was to generalize, I would say that the South African press has missed key opportunities to really deliver hard hitting, analytical coverage that really drives for accountability.
I think we're going to leave on that note, Zanele. Thank you so much for giving us your time, and really, really appreciate the work that you do.
Thank you so much.